Why do you still do it? Why are you still out here?
Well, it goes back to the destiny thing. I made a bargain with it, a long time ago, and I'm holding up my end.
The room was completely silent. No cameras. No crowd. No screaming fans anywhere in sight. Just a man, sitting alone at a piano in a dimly lit room, playing a melody that no one had ever heard before. He wasn't performing. He wasn't recording. He was just playing. Like a man who had forgotten the entire world was watching, or maybe, like a man who had finally decided he no longer cared. And when people saw it, they didn't know what to think. This wasn't the Bob Dylan they grew up with. This wasn't the fearless voice of a generation. This wasn't the icon who rewrote the rules of music and walked away from fame at the peak of it. This was something quieter. Something more raw. Something that felt almost private. And somehow, that made it more powerful than anything he had ever done on a stage. Fans who had followed him for decades stopped and stared. Not because he looked broken. Not because he seemed lost. But because for the first time in his entire life, he seemed completely free. Free in a way nobody had expected. Free in a way that left people asking a question they had never been able to answer. Who is Bob Dylan, really? Because the man the world thought it knew, and the man behind the legend, had never been the same person. And the truth about that gap was far more surprising than anyone had imagined. To understand where Bob Dylan is today, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not the beginning the world remembers. Not the protest songs. Not the electric guitar. The real beginning. A small mining town in northern Minnesota called Hibbing. Cold, flat, industrial, the kind of place most people spend their whole lives trying to leave. Robert Allen Zimmerman was born there in 1941. Quiet kid. Restless kid. A kid who sat glued to the radio for hours while the rest of his family ate dinner, listening to sounds that felt like they were coming from somewhere 1,000 miles away. His parents wanted him to study. To be sensible. To stay close to home. But something inside him was already gone. By the time he was a teenager, he had taught himself guitar, devoured every record he could find, and fallen head over heels for the raw rebellion of Little Richard and Buddy Holly. He wasn't just a fan. He was obsessed. Like a man who had already seen his future and couldn't get there fast enough. When he arrived in New York City in 1961, barely 20 years old, carrying a beat-up acoustic guitar and a brand new name, nobody noticed him. Nobody stopped. Nobody cared. But that was about to change. Within 2 years, Bob Dylan had become something no one had words for. His voice was strange. Unpolished. Almost uncomfortable to listen to at first. But the words were something else entirely. Songs that made people stop in the middle of whatever they were doing and just listen. Songs that felt less like music and more like a warning. Songs that made a generation feel like someone had finally said out loud what they had all been thinking in silence. He didn't just write songs. He wrote movements. And the world grabbed onto him and refused to let go. But here is the part that changes everything, because the moment the world decided who Bob Dylan was, Bob Dylan quietly decided to become someone else entirely. Fame is a strange kind of prison. And for Bob Dylan, the walls started closing in earlier than most people realize. By the mid-1960s, the pressure surrounding him was almost impossible to describe. Every song he released was analyzed like scripture. Every interview felt like a courtroom. Every public appearance was a battle between the man he actually was and the symbol everyone else needed him to be. The voice of a generation. The prophet. The conscience of America. He never asked for any of those titles. And the weight of them was quietly crushing him. Then in 1966, it happened. A motorcycle accident near his home in Woodstock, New York. The details were kept deliberately vague. Even today, no one knows the. No tours. No albums. No interviews. At the absolute peak of his fame, surrounded by a world that couldn't get enough of him, he simply vanished. 2 full years of silence. Most people assumed the accident was the reason. But the people who were actually close to him whispered something else entirely. They said the accident was almost a relief. That it gave him the one thing fame had taken away from him completely. An excuse to stop. When he finally returned, something had shifted in him. He was quieter. More guarded. More careful about what he let the world see. And the people around him noticed something they never talked about publicly. From that point forward, there were 2 Bob Dylans. The one who stood on stages and played to thousands. And the one who went home afterward and existed behind closed doors, in a silence that no one was ever allowed inside. But what happened next changed everything. Behind every great public story, there is a private one that most people were never meant to see. And Bob Dylan's private story was filled with things that would have shocked the world, if the world had known. His first marriage to Sarah Lones in 1965 was kept almost entirely secret. The press didn't even find out for 2 years. Together they built a life. Had children. Created something that felt real and solid in the middle of all the chaos swirling around them. But the road was destroying everything. Dylan toured relentlessly. He disappeared for months at a time. He surrounded himself with a kind of noise and chaos that left no room for the people who actually loved him. And slowly, quietly, one of the most important relationships of his life began to fall apart. Sarah filed for divorce in 1977. He never gave interviews about it. He never sat down with a journalist and talked about what it cost him. But he did something that spoke louder than any interview ever could. He made an album. Blood on the Tracks released in 1975. 16 tracks of raw, bleeding, barely contained heartbreak. Critics called it a masterpiece. Fans called it the most honest thing he had ever recorded. And the people who knew both of them said you could hear every argument, every silence, every moment of loss, in every single note. He never admitted it was about Sarah. But no one who listened to it seriously believed it was about anything else. And then, just when you think the story couldn't get more hidden, it did. In 1986, Bob Dylan got married again. To a backing singer named Carolyn Dennis. They had a daughter together. And almost nobody on earth knew it was happening. The marriage was kept completely secret for years. Even after it ended in divorce in 1992, Dylan said almost nothing publicly. 2 marriages. Children. Heartbreak. Loss. Loyalty. All of it hidden from the world that thought it owned him. And through every single bit of it, he kept touring. By the early 1990s, Dylan had launched what fans and journalists started calling the never-ending tour. Hundreds of shows a year. Small venues. Large arenas. Tiny clubs. Every corner of the world. Year after year after year, without pause, without explanation. People started asking why. He had nothing left to prove. Nothing left to earn. Nothing he hadn't already done 10 times over. And that is exactly when things took the most shocking turn of all. In 1997, Bob Dylan almost died. He was rushed to hospital with a serious infection that had spread to the sac surrounding his heart. A condition called histoplasmosis pericarditis. Doctors described his condition as life-threatening. For a brief, terrifying window of time, the world held its breath. Dylan himself later described it with the kind of dark humor that only he could pull off. He said he genuinely thought he was going to meet Elvis. But he survived. And what came next left everyone who thought they understood him completely speechless. Rather than slowing down, he went straight back into the studio and came out with Time Out of Mind. A dark, devastating album about mortality and loneliness and the terrifying awareness of time running out. It was unlike anything he had made in years. Unflinching. Uncompromising. The kind of record that only comes from someone who has genuinely stared at the end and walked back from it. It won the Grammy for Album of the Year. Critics who had spent years dismissing him as a relic were suddenly calling him a genius again. Not out of nostalgia. Not out of respect for what he used to be. Because the music itself demanded it. It was as if nearly dying had broken something open inside him. Some door that had been locked for decades. And what poured out of it was extraordinary. But there was something else happening too. Something quieter. Something that would turn out to be even more revealing than the music. In the early 2000s, Dylan released a memoir. Chronicles, Volume 1. And the world was not prepared for what was inside it. Because the man on those pages was not a prophet. He was not an icon. He was not the voice of a generation or the conscience of America. He was a confused, scared, uncertain young man from a small town in Minnesota who figured things out as he went along. Who made mistakes. Who felt lost. Who had no idea what he was doing half the time and was terrified for most of it. He was just a person. And that hit people harder than any of the music ever had. Some fans felt betrayed. Like the myth they had carried for decades had been quietly dismantled. Others said it was the first time they had ever truly felt close to him. Like the wall had finally come down after 60 years. But the truth behind even that was still more surprising than anyone expected. By the time Bob Dylan reached his late 70s, the world had already decided the story was over. He had done everything. Said everything. Become everything. Surely, at some point, even Bob Dylan had to stop. He did not stop. In 2020, at 79 years old, in the middle of a global pandemic that had shut the entire music industry down and sent every other artist scrambling for relevance, Dylan released Rough and Rowdy Ways. The reviews were staggering. Not charitable. Not nostalgic. Staggering. Critics who had spent their careers analyzing his legacy were writing about this album like it was the best thing he had ever made. Like somehow, at an age when most artists are coasting on what they built 50 years ago, he had found an entirely new level. One track on the album runs over 16 minutes. Murder Most Foul. A haunting, sprawling meditation on the assassination of JFK and the soul of an entire country. It was not built for radio. It was not designed to chart. It was not built to sell anything to anyone. It debuted at number 1. And somewhere in that fact lives the entire mystery of Bob Dylan. He has spent 84 years refusing to be what the world needed him to be. He has been booed off stages and handed Nobel Prizes. He has married in secret and buried his heartbreak in albums. He has walked away from the biggest moments of his career and then shown up, completely without warning, and reminded everyone exactly who they were dealing with. The man who once said he was never any more than what he was, has spent his entire life proving exactly that. And what he is, right now, today, is something no one who bought his first record in 1962 could ever have predicted. Today, Bob Dylan lives quietly. He paints. He welds sculptures in a private studio. He occasionally tours, not because he needs the money, not because anyone is pushing him, but because standing on a stage with a guitar in his hands is simply who he has always been. It is the one thing that was never performance. The one thing that was never for anyone else. He gives almost no interview.